There we go.
I'm so excited. Can we just talk real quick about what you did? I know you don't think it's a big deal, but I was just like, oh my gosh, she's so cool. Just like, yeah.
Yep.
Look,
I did the
she
thing.
has slides and code
I
all in
do.
one little tab because she put her slides, like built them in line with Markdown.
Yep. Well, that way I didn't have to toggle between like 10 screens and make it all difficult, and it's easier for me, and it's easier for, everybody can see all in one place what we're talking about, which is forms, which will be super awesome.
I am so impressed. Ah. So tell us, we are talking about forms today. This one kind of makes me want to hyperventilate. I just feel like there's a lot to do with it. So I'm really, really excited. But yes, you take it away and I will field any questions as they come.
So what about PowerPoint transitions? No. I mean, you could. Markdown takes CSS. I could have put in transitions in there. I didn't, but I could have, because animations for the win. Anyway, that's a complete that is a complete tangent, because what we're going to talk about is forms. And yes, as you said, there's a lot to go with forms, and I've actually narrowed it down. And what I'm going to do is we're going to build up a form together, from kind of looking at all the way from inputs all the way to some of the validation, so that we can talk about the little gotchas that we can find along the way. And so I think it goes to say that good accessibility on form kind of impacts everyone. Um, like I can't think of anybody that wouldn't impact to have a form that doesn't work well. I'm sure we've all had that form we just couldn't figure out how to fill out, right? Because of one reason or another. And that's annoying as all get out, especially when you have to fill it out for something. So that's we can, I think I'll agree on that one. So when we look at forms, these are all, according to the MDN, all of the different types of things we can shove in a form. So there's a lot to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus a little bit on input. I mean, there's because forms, you could do an all-day stream on just them and probably still not cover everything. So in half an hour, I had to kind of narrow that down a little bit. So we're going to focus in on input a little bit. And we have this blank form right here. And here's our code for the blank. Nope, not you. That one. We have the code for the blank form. So let's go ahead and add a couple input fields to kind of see what the difference is between some of the fields. So we're going to have a type text, because that's kind of a fun standard, right? And we're going to do an input type email. That one comes up a lot. And input.
You have no idea how excited I am for this talk. Like, you're even the fact that you're starting from scratch, like, and you're like with a blank form. I'm like, okay, I can do this. I can follow.
I didn't know how technical people were going to be, so I figured we'd start from the bottom and work our way up.
But I'm so,
Of
if you
the
don't
stack.
mind stealing this format that you have beautifully created,
Go for it.
the slides and the code and it's all right there. Ugh, you're blowing my mind.
So we have 4 input fields, right? And this is going to expose our very first problem with accessibility that we see a lot with forms, is labels. Because right now we have absolutely no labels. And so we don't even know, like, yeah, okay, I've got the code up so you can tell. But if I hide this code, you have no idea what's here, like which one's what's going on. So the kind of the first big problem we have with a lot of forms is that we can see, we can see it, and we'll do things to visually add a label, but they're not programmatically tied together. And so what a screen reader user sees, or a disabled user, depending on which assistive technology they're using, is basically this. It's like, here's a form, have fun. I'm not going to tell you what I want in the boxes, but I'm going to yell at you if you don't put the right things in the boxes. So let's go ahead and add some labels now. So for my text, I'm just going to put it name. So we have a couple ways we can add labels. First off, labels should have a label, label tag. That's what that thing is called. And we're going to, but now I have a label, but I haven't associated this label with this input. So from that standpoint, It doesn't mean a whole lot of anything. It just means I have a name and an input, but I haven't said this label actually goes with this input. So to put those two things together, I'm going to do a for. I'm going to say this label is for this input. And so at this point, I'm going to give it an ID equals name. And that way I'm going to associate these two. And you'll see that on the screen over here, these two things haven't moved. They haven't changed in any way, shape, or form visually, but now our assistive technologies can know that they go together. So again, super, super easy. We do label for equals, whatever our ID is going to be. I'm going to make the ID email, and then we're going to say email. And then over here, we can put an ID of email. The other way we can associate them together is actually nest them inside of each other. So instead of having to have IDs, which IDs need to be unique, so you have to have the IDs, you have to come up with a bunch of IDs that are going to be unique. The other way you can do it is to do label number, label, like I'm going to come number, very craftfully and funly decided. And I'm going to put my input inside of my label. So I haven't had to associate an ID or anything, but because the input is inside of the label, is nested as a child of the label, then they're associated. So that's another way we can do that. And I can do the same thing with date, where I can put label date. So if you have a form that's maybe going to be repeated on the page more than once and you're having repeated ID problems, that's that's a way of doing that can solve the repeated ID situation. So now we have everything, we have labels on everything, but see how like this is kind of gross. So let's fix that, because now it's kind of hard to tell what's what in terms of who goes with what. So we're going to write a little bit of CSS to say that my label and my inputs are displayed block, so we can stack them. And the reason I want them stacked, and we're also going to add a little bit of space right above label margin top. And that gives us some space. And so the reason I want them stacked is because now what I have is I have predictability. Unlike before, where we were inline, where you didn't really necessarily know where to start, where to stop, etc. Now I know for sure I've got my label, my input. So imagine if I'm using a screen magnifier, for example, I can go down my left-hand side and find all of my fields. If I had a field over here to the right, it'd be really easy for me to miss that there's a field there. So by putting everything to the left, I can have a one straight shot, making sure I've got all my fields that I have. I know that this input, this label goes with this input for sure. It's nice and predictable. The other thing is done is actually for your power users is going to bring efficiency, because if you think of the eye tracking of it, it's one straight down line. If we don't know where the next field is, if there's maybe sometimes fields are here, no, you're having to play this game, this exact game. And so by always putting everything stacked to the left, in left to right writing languages. Obviously, if it's a right to left language, we would flip everything around. But for English, by stacking everything to the left, we have predictability and we have efficiency for power users and eye tracking. So it's kind of going to be your best case scenario. The other thing we can do is I could actually shorten this field. Like say this number, I'm looking at the number of pets you have, for example. That's never going to be a huge number. The likelihood of that, other than maybe a fish tank, the likelihood of that number, or a zookeeper, the likelihood of that number being under 100 is fairly, fairly
Mm,
predictably a small number. So shortening that up to kind of match the size of the content we're expecting will help our users kind of um, off the bat know what kind of information we're looking for. State is a perfect example. If we're looking for the acronym versus the long form, if we're looking for the acronym or the two-letter, putting a nice short one is going to be a lot nicer than putting a long text where you're looking for like IN.
mm. So
Um,
Brave was saying,
oh,
"What about an ant farm?" So completely accurate. And then Boss was saying, "I did not know this trick." So people are learning. I love this question though. You were saying that if they're nested like that, this is an alternative way of associating it, but I assumed even if you nest, you still need to do the matching for an ID.
Nope,
Is that not necessarily true?
nope. Because they're and you can the so the accessibility in Chrome, if you open the DevTools and you pick the accessibility tab, you can see the
Mm,
accessibility tree and it will tell you what associations are with what. And so you want to see that label is there. And if what you'll see is that when you nest them, it totally finds it. And it'll tell you, like with the for, it'll tell you that it's associated it using the for technique, but with the label, it'll totally show you that they're associated and that you're fine and good to go. So
okay.
you don't actually need the foreign ID for this, for if they're
Yeah.
nested.
And stop me if you are going to get to this, but do you have opinions on floating labels? And
I
like,
personally do not like them.
mm,
I don't have research to back it.
mm.
So
I I always stray away from them and advise people to do the same, just because oftentimes implementation with floating labels can be a bit wonky, and so then tabbing through sometimes isn't as clean as it could be with a form like the one you've created here. But I didn't know if you were like, I have a floating label hack. So
no, there's two reasons I'm not a huge fan. One is you've got this constant animation that if it's usually can't be turned off. In most implementations of the
yeah,
floating labels, you can't turn it off. And that in and
mm,
of itself, I find annoying. And then where you're tabbing through, you've got stuff moving all over the place all the time, and your
yeah,
label's not consistently in the same place. And a lot of the implementation, the label becomes teeny, teeny, tiny as soon like in compare like if you think of font size, right? So
yes.
now the readability of it for anybody who doesn't have absolutely perfect vision is pretty well crap. So
Yeah.
I'm not a
I think
fan.
Brave was saying, what about material design where the label's embedded? I don't know if embedded means floating, but when we're talking about this label, we're talking about where the label itself is acting as the placeholder. And then when you click on the input, it floats up above it and is now a label while you're typing. I think certain implementations of it, when you click out of the input, it goes away. So that can also be detrimental because, some things are obvious. Oh, that was my email and I messed up, but some other inputs might not be. So having that permanent label
Yeah.
there is always my advice. But I don't know. Do you know if the material design one is different? I'm not sure.
So the material design one will take up the placeholder becomes the label. So when it's empty, if you're using the label and you're using the floating one, um, so um, like if I were to put email here as placeholder, placeholder equals email. What would happen
Mm,
is as soon as you start typing, like this wouldn't be there, and then as soon as you start typing, this would go
pop
up
up.
here, but again, teeny tiny. Um, I'm not a fan, but that's more because that trains developers to think that placeholders are labels, and
Yeah.
they're not. They're very much not. For two reasons. One, semantically, for assistive technologies, they just don't work. And the second reason is, as soon as I start typing in here, as Alyssa mentioned earlier, that goes away. So I now don't know what that was. So say from this number, as soon as let's say number of pets, like we were talking about earlier, as soon as I type in, now that 22 refers to what? You know.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so placeholders are not labels. They're great for giving users hints on what you're looking for. So I could say over here for my placeholder for email, I could say user@email.com to give them an idea of what I'm looking for. But it's not, by no means is it the label. Um,
I'm curious. Let me know, Brave, if you know. I'm curious if material gives you the ability to disable that or to like if it's opt-in or something. Like I'm wondering if they just use it by default. Because that I have before tried to essentially like navigate through all of my flows in an app with just keyboard, and that was one of the things that I kind of ran into a weird issue with. So very interesting.
Material
Okay.
can, I know that one. Material can actually, you can choose
Oh,
to make
nice.
the label fixed. So it'll stick it at the top and always have it at the top. The font size is just really small. That's the
Okay,
part I don't like
I got
about
you.
it. Hey, to each their own. I mean, at that point, um, what I find funny is that Google commissioned a study through the University of Leipzig to figure out font sizing on and to figure out what was readable in a form for font size. And they found out that 16 pixels is the smallest you can go. And then they create form fields like that don't follow that rule. So I thought it was pretty interesting.
I just want to say, companies be large, and my company's not even as large as Google, and sometimes we have issues like communicating between teams. So I just want to give a little bit of grace there. I feel like but no, I'm with you on that. I do try
But
the
I
the
think
14-16 rule. Mm,
the logic is that by the time you've entered the information, the important bit is the information entered, no longer the label. And that
mm.
is that I think and I think that's the logic behind it. So I guess that would be okay. But anywho, so moving on with labels and stuff because otherwise I don't know.
No,
Um,
yeah, let's do it.
Oh yeah, we went over layout, so that's super cool. Because we can argue about differences in opinions about where to place the label all day long. That's for sure. Yeah, we went over that. Validation. So we have our labels. So the cool thing here is because I use completely semantic HTML, right? And I gave him types. So the fact that I gave it a type email over here or a type number, first off with my type number, if I try to type a letter, like I'm trying to type letters in it, it won't let me do it. It's only going to let me type numbers. So it's already got some guardrails for me that I don't have to build. Same for date, I can type it in or I can go ahead and, pick it. And I already have controls. Now, fair warning on things like controls on the date, those are going to be very browser and OS specific as to one, what they look like, and two, if they even work. So that's kind of test that on some of that. I know that that date specifically for a very and time as well for a long time were only supported in Chrome. I can't remember if they're a little bit
Oh,
they're on other browsers now, but I know that that was a date for a long time only had this in Chrome. I know color, for example, is one that's a little weird in terms of its support. Anywho, so we can have some baked in things based on what we put. The other thing is if I add a submit button
I'm
over
looking on can I
here.
use? It looks like, everything but Opera Mini and IE.
Oh,
So
cool. Well, IE's dead, so that's fine. I
you've
was
heard it
so
here.
happy when Microsoft finally killed IE for good. Mhm.
Is it dead? Is it? Don't some people still have to write for it? No, let me know, chat.
Uh,
If you're still writing for it, let me know.
Microsoft officially said it was dead. That's my excuse for not supporting it. So we have a button in here, and so if I try to click submit, if I could type garbage in my email and I could try to click submit, is it not? Oh, I need to save things. That would be good. Saving things is good. If I type garbage in here, it's going to yell at me. Of course, it doesn't yell at me. Why does it not yelling at me? Because I'm doing a demo live, of course. Oh, because I gave it a type button. It needs a type submit. That's why. There we go. Okay, so it should yell at me, but this is not a valid email address. And so when we use specific types, it will by default have some validation, which is super cool because that means I don't necessarily need to validate, come up with a pattern and write the regex and yada, 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 yada for this email. It's already going to yell at me. The other thing that's really cool about that, I'm gonna make this guy required. And we're gonna go into the big ol' how to make things required. So I'm gonna make this guy required. Now it's gonna yell at me when I try to submit that, hey, this needs required. But that's not really cool for our users to kind of not tell them from the get-go that it's required. So we can do the very stereotypical, let's add an asterisk, which has become an incredibly common pattern. But what I always tell people is don't assume your users know what the asterisks mean. You probably want to add something along the lines of, fields marked with an asterisk. And I always put the little symbol in case people don't know what it
Mm,
is. Um,
mm,
field mode are required. And so now what I've done is I've made it very clear what the symbol means without making the assumption that my user knows the convention. The other aspect we can do is go ahead and assume everything's required, and then if something is optional, then actually mark it as optional. Because in an ideal world, optional. In an ideal world, we would never really ask for anything that was optional, right? If we're asking for it, it's because we actually really, really need it, and everything else is just superfluous. So in an ideal world, we would never be asking for anything that's not technically required. Um, Social media profiles may be kind of a different aspect to that, but in like think your general app, you know, um, we don't want to be asking for data we don't really need. So
mm.
those are kind of the ways we can mark something as required. The other thing we can do is start writing
Ooh,
CSS without even, and notice I haven't written any JavaScript yet, and I don't plan on it in this demo. We can start writing CSS to mark, hey, this field, it's required, it's gonna fail, it's technically invalid. We can actually start delineating that with just CSS by saying input, I'm gonna use its pseudo class of invalid. I'm gonna give it a border left.
thanks for the follow, Roller Dev. And
Or
I know we missed some follows earlier this morning, so thank you all.
X red. So if I give this one, I'm going to make it bigger than that so it's really obvious. This
Oh, I
isn't a
like it.
design talk. So now I'm essentially, I've said, yeah, this is not a design talk.
I
Not in
don't
terms
know
of
what you're
visuals.
talking about. I so far would ship it. I'm pretty satisfied with this form. So
But so we know it's invalid, and now when I start typing in it, it's totally valid. Invalid, valid. Yeah, so I can start differentiating my forms that are valid and invalid just via CSS. Now keep in mind that um, we want to use more than color to differentiate. And what this thing doesn't do is, oh sure, I've told my user it's invalid. It's got a much thicker border. And it's red. However, what I haven't done is told them why, right? Because if we have multiple pattern validations, so let's think email, for example, maybe my email is required and has needs to be correctly formed. The issue could be that the email was required, or the issue could be that the email isn't correctly formed. I need to be able to at some point differentiate between those things and tell the user how would I go about fixing it.
mm,
And so what we can, and that's where error messaging comes in. And I can do something along the lines of div class equals error. And I need to, and I'm going to put a paragraph in there and I'm going to explain why I'm putting a paragraph in here in just a second. And I'm going to say name is required. So we can style our error, and color red.
I'm
There
getting some love in the chat. My favorite
we go.
UI instructor. Mm.
Nice. Thank you. I much appreciate that. So the problem is now if I type, we still have the error message, right? I'm not hiding it for any way, shape, or form. And the other big problem is that, sure, I have an email error saying that name is required, but what field does this belong to? Does it belong to name, or does it belong to email, or does it belong to my date down here? Like I haven't associated this with anything. So this is a little bit of ARIA we can add to go ahead and associate it and say that I'm going to say that my field is being described by another place in our application. So I can say that ARIA is described by this error. So I'm going to give this an ID because everything with ARIA is related to IDs. So I'm going to call it name error so that I can later remember what in the world that was for. And I'm going to say, there we go. So now I've associated this error message that is visible with my input. So now the screen readers, assistive technologies, and so on will know that this error belongs to here. Now, the other thing I need to do is I need to hide it when it's actually valid, right? This is actually legitimately valid now. and I'm still showing an error message. So that's not cool. So what I'm going to say is by default, the paragraph inside of my error is display. I want the paragraph specifically. Is going to be display none. And that's why I put the paragraph, because right now I'm hiding that error messages by default, which is cool. I'm referencing an ID over here with my described by. I can't make that go away. I have to make sure that that div still exists. Otherwise, I'm telling it it's described by this thing that doesn't exist. Cool, we're good. This will be fine, right? No, it won't. The other thing that that allows me to do now is give this, and because this is going to get edited as they type based on the fact that I'm basing validity upon what's being in the actual field itself. So I'm going to give it an aria live, and I'm going to give it an aria live of, and I can now remember it's aria live polite. There we go. So I'm going to give it an aria live polite. And that means that that means that it's going to go ahead and announce that something is going on in here, that things in here are going to change, but it's because it's going to change as they type. I don't want to necessarily interrupt their typing with this being with this kind of yelling at them. If I were to make this appear on blur, I would probably do an area assertive, because once they're going to blur, they're going to tap to the next one. I want them to come back to here, right?
Mm.
And so I want them to make sure that they didn't miss that that popped up. If I'm doing if I'm doing it as they type, I'm going to make it polite, because they're going to tab, they're going to get to the next thing, it's going to be there, and then we don't have the quite. By the time they're moving on further down the HTML, it's going to be here, and I don't have the
So
problem of them accidentally skipping over.
the first time I used polite, I'm in love with it because it's essentially the way I think of it is like this area is now being watched for announcements.
Correct.
Um, but I've never used assertive. And so I love that you're bringing this up. And I wanted to ask, so it behaves the same, it's just a bit more aggressive than polite?
Yes, so polite waits until, so say it's reading let's say the screen reader is reading a paragraph of something to you. And so if you're doing an area polite, it's going to wait till it's done going through that paragraph and say, hey, something happened. If it's an area assertive, it's going to interrupt what it was doing and what it was reading and go ahead and say what's going on. So it's the severity of the error. So
Okay.
if you think about it, you've got area live polite, and assertive is basically aria live rude. It's going to interrupt. That's the way I usually think about it. You've got polite and rude.
Rude. I love it. No, I absolutely love it. And I think a lot of people, someone was saying earlier, so this is how we CSS. I think if you try this out, I definitely recommend also going through it with a screen reader and seeing how taking out like that ARIA live and then adding it in, how it changes the flow a little bit. It's really cool to witness. So
All right, so now we still need to make it display, because right now we're still invalid, but I'm still not displaying it. So
mm,
the simplest pure CSS way to do that is to go ahead and say, because by default I've given the paragraph a display none. So I'm going to add my input that is invalid. I want the immediate child, that's the plus. So in an immediate sibling that is a class error, I want that paragraph tag. And that paragraph tag, if it's invalid and you have an immediate sibling that is error, and that paragraph tag, I'm going to do a display block. And that, in theory, so now it shows up. If I type in it, it disappears, and we've got something visible. So at this point, we're at a situation where we can have a perfectly functional, accessible form here where we're showing error messages, we're giving feedback, and notice that I did not disable the submit. And the reason being is what happens is if I forget about this field, because for whatever reason, I'm going to look up the information for it later, and I come down here, it's going to bring me back to that one being why it's wrong. If this is disabled and I'm a little bit scrolled, or I'm using a screen reader, a magnifier or whatever, I now have no idea why it's disabled. It's just kind of disabled, and I'm stuck on my own trying to figure out when in the world can I not submit this form. If I leave it disabled, if I leave it enabled and just have it respond with, here are my errors, that prevents the issue of being stuck of why can't I not submit. So at this point, this is where I would start adding the JavaScript, where maybe we can tailor this message. Maybe we can start by hiding it until the field has been touched or dirty, so that we don't
Mm,
start the form by yelling at the person that they've done it wrong, even though they haven't touched it yet. This is where you would start, but you can have something perfectly usable, perfectly accessible without having to touch JavaScript. And writing exactly like 2 little bits of aria. Like, I haven't written a lot of aria in here. The only aria I've written is to kind of say, mark things as as things to listen to and to connect things. That's really the only place. I'm not changing roles. I'm not manipulating
mm.
things. I'm simply adding in a little bit of information where HTML doesn't have a way to provide it in and of its own. So that's kind of like where I would start with my forms, especially to build something, because now you can add all the fancies on top, but you have a solid base, and it's going to be a lot easier to keep it accessible once you have a solid base to build on.
I love it. Brave was saying, are we talking about pristine or am I ahead? And I think that is whenever you were talking about adding in your JavaScript. I think so. I think that's what we were talking about.
Right. Right. It is, and the concept of a pristine and dirty, and those are all terms that are available in because Material and Angular add those in.
Mm,
Those are not necessarily there in every framework, and they're definitely not there in regular HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So those are things that Material is adding in for you. They are not things that just exist um,
mm.
natively. So I can't do I can't do an input like pristine, that's not a thing, or an input dirty, that's not a thing either, right?
It's hard to remember, for me at least, what's native sometimes because you use these frameworks so often that you're like, is that built in? Oh God. So, uh,
Yep.
Blocking said that I had better add a new user story to our backlog to look at form accessibility for people who need to use screen readers and the sort. This was amazing just because of how approachable you made this, Martine. Like so many times, especially with accessibility in general, but form accessibility, like it just feels like a lot to tackle. So I just absolutely love how you presented this, and it was just even for like the non front end dev, I feel like it was really really approachable. So thank you so much for this.
Well, thank you for
Um,
having me.
do you have any picks or like check out my website or I'm going to be in person at this place? I know chat was saying that they love to watch you at Code Palooza. So that's awesome. But is there anything you want to highlight?
Well, I do keep a list of where I'm going to be speaking next and all of that fun stuff on my website at martine.dev. And I do have a Twitch channel, and I Twitch every Thursday at 1 p.m. EST. So if you feel free to hit me up on that, and you can find all of the links to all of the things at on my website. So martine.dev.
Awesome. I'm gonna copy the URL because I don't know why it didn't make it a link. So apologies, friends. But yes, that was wonderful. Any last comments or questions for Martine before we swap out, switch out? Hi, Catherine.
I'm back here to execute the swap. But yeah, actually, if I remember correctly, Martine, you're at Codestock in April, right? Which I think I remember seeing because I will also be there. So we'll get to meet in person, which I'm very excited about. So
I
there's a,
still
there's
need
a
to
little
figure
promo.
out. I still need to figure out the logistics of code stock.
Mm.
Behind the curve.
Sorry, I shouldn't have like promoted if you weren't like.
No, it's all good. I need to figure out some things. So, but yeah, it's all good.
Well, thank you so much. We will let you head off, but I really appreciate your input during the roundtable and for this talk. It was really good. I appreciate you so
Thank you
much.
for having me.
It's fantastic.
Oh, so our next speaker, Ashlee, I will add you to the screen when you're ready. But let's go ahead and bring on Ashlee for our next talk. Hi.
Hey.
Hello.